scholarship that's been written on democracy promotion in general, and Central Asia, because of the lack of success of all those democracy promotion programs, has also received a lot of attention recently. So most of the studies, they look at either mechanisms of democracy promotion, how to, or like the amount of money invested, or the kind of actors that are involved, NGOs versus governments versus enterprises, okay? And I am siding with this new group of researchers who decided to move away from how to in democracy promotion to what is being promoted, okay, the substance of democracy promotion. So my project is looking at the substance of democracy promotion in Central Asia. And I am trying to compare the substances of democracy promotion by the United States, European Union, and Central Asian governments. So that's the question. And FYI, even in the United States, there are so many different actors which are involved in democracy promotion. USAID, Department of State, Department of Defense to a certain extent. There are like multitude of programs, bilateral, multilateral. Then there are NGOs, subcontractors, enterprises, initiatives. So it's a messy realm to delve into. So for the purpose of this research that I'm doing, I decided to look at as many policy documents as possible issued by USAID, and U.S. Department of State, because they receive a bulk of funds from the U.S. within the United States to promote democracy overseas, and they set the agenda. Okay, and then in European Union, it's about European Commission and Council, European Council statements that I looked at to identify some common aspects, which I call frames. So I'm using. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the underlying theoretical framework, but as you approach this, hundreds and hundreds of policy statements, you have to have some sort of a conceptual framework in mind to analyze them, because then they're going to make no sense. Okay, so I'm using this analytical framework of frames to examine democracy promotion, which is essentially discourse about how do we view democracy, what is it made of, So all those discourses and practices promoting different alternative visions of democracy and models of democratization can be conceptualized as frames. And I had a feeling that the liberal democratic models are not incontestable, or they're actually there are lots of alternative ways of thinking about democracy that have appeared in recent decades. So I'm talking about frames, I'm talking about different representations, different discourses, different substances of democracy in this research. So I'm using this framing perspective as a way of simplifying very complex discourses, very complex sets of policies to make them amenable to say the investigation. So frames are just narratives about what's going on in terms of democracy in Central Asia, why we got where we are finding ourselves today, and what needs to be done. So again, for analytical purposes, I divide all those discourses into several sections. Diagnosis, what's going on? How do we assess the state of democracy in Central Asia? Well, from there, what do we do about it, the diagnostic part, okay? So I'm going to walk really quickly through these different conceptions of democracy by Western donors and by Central Asian elites to move on to something that I did this summer, something that I really wanted to share with you, and you are the first ones who are going to be seeing the survey results that I carried out this past summer, okay? And an important caveat is that it's an oversimplification, okay? These are just some very general commonalities in the way Western donors and Central Asian elites frame democracy, democratization, and ways to get there, okay? There are important differences between the United States views on democracy promotion and European Union, and I can address those in Q&A section part of this presentation. There are also important differences in the way Central Asian governments view democracy and democratization, but I omit all those differences for the sake of simplicity and because of time constraints, okay? But if you want me to talk about those differences, I'll be happy to address those. And again, it's an oversimplification. This is something that, there are all these voices about what democracy is all about, and kind of the strongest voice is what I'm presenting here. So, in terms of what's, the way Western donors assess the situation with democracy in Central Asia. So, in their response to this question, what happened to democracy in Central Asia? The Western frame suggests that Central Asian states have failed to follow through on their democratic aspirations and all degenerated into variants of authoritarianism. And if you read policy statements, oftentimes those states are referred to as authoritarian presidentialism, semi-authoritarianism, tyrannies, personal dictatorships, all this language is used. And in terms of the sources of democratic deadlock, it's, those familiar ones: political culture, Soviet history, elites, incompatible values, clan-based rules, norms, and so on and so forth. So even though the Western donors agree in their assessment, that democracy has reached an impasse, they say, no, but we should continue investing our human, financial, and other resources into promoting democracy there, okay? So to continue assisting Central Asian states in setting up Western-type liberal democracy. And you all know that in academia and in political circles, democracy is a very contentious term, yeah? And although there are some differences in understanding democracy, the agreement is that we can use Western template, whether it's an American template or US or the EU template, and we can kind of transpose this template onto Central Asian grounds into Central Asian states. And the emphasis, of course, is placed on elections, institutions, parties, political rights. And these ideas about democracy are based on some underlying beliefs, and we all, so there are justifications for democracy, linking it to some intrinsic benefits of democratic governance, because this is the best form of governance for, promoting human rights. But there are also some practical considerations for promoting democratic governance, because it's linked to peace, stability, economic prosperity, economic growth. Okay, so that's one side of the story. Then the second side of the story, so Central Asian governments, and here I'm drawing mostly on statements of the Kazakh, Uzbek, and Kyrgyz. I haven't really looked at Turkmen and Tajik, okay? So they are in disagreement. They are claiming that the democratic failure verdict is not, it's fiercely criticized by the governments of those states. The Central Asian leaders argue that their countries have made substantial progress in the area of democratization, as evidenced in modern constitutions, parliaments, parties, as well as other legal, socioeconomic, and political reforms. But they are careful in kind of qualifying their references to democracy by saying that it's not the Western democracy that we are trying to build here. We're actually building our own Asian, and they use Kyrgyz democracy or Kazakh democracy or Uzbek democracy. So all those expressions which use democracy as part of them have been used with qualifying terms: Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, or Asian. Okay, and again, those are different models, but there are some similarities. And one of those similarities is that they are rejecting the existence of universal formulas for democratization or universal models of democracy. They're all claiming that their forms of government should be built, taking into consideration their histories, their cultural context, the mentality of people. They are also emphasizing gradualism, gradual movement towards democracy. It cannot be built up in fast. And then they emphasize economic reforms prior to any kind of political liberalization. And in Kazakhstan, for example, the model of presidential democracy has been viewed as more compatible with its historical tradition and political culture. It has been widely accepted in both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that only a strong leader is capable of resolving political economic crisis accompanying their transition from communism to independence. And there's a very different set of values that underlies this frame. It's it believes that security and stability should precede any kind of political liberalization. So without first building stable state and society, you cannot democratize it. So it's all about stability, security, and those values take precedence. Okay? All right. So why it's important? It's important because the way we talk about things, including democracy, influences. So there are targets. There are targets, people as well as other elites. And so the way we talk about something like democracy is going to affect their values, attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors. Okay. So the more our discourse resonates with what the targets believe in, the more influential this discourse or this frame is going to be. And how do we evaluate frame resonance? Well, there are several criteria, such as narrative fidelity. Narrative fidelity denotes the correspondence of the frame, ideas and symbols, values used in the frame, to the target society's cultural and political stock, which is the country's national ideology, political knowledge, mentality, people's cultural narratives, traditions, myths. Salience, how, whether the frame talks about the issues which are important to people, something that is extremely important for them today. Okay, consistency, how all those values, but the consistency between what they say and behavior, and consistency within the frame, and credibility. But I'll talk about it later. So I was interested in how frames used by the Western donors in Central Asian states resonate with the public. So I went to Central Asia, where I spent most of the summer, and I carried out, I would say, a pretty complex survey consisting of eight groups of questions. I was targeting just people. I didn't want to talk to academics. I just wanted to talk to people in the streets. The survey was carried out mostly in capitals, in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, and Almaty in Astana in Kazakhstan. It wasn't big and it wasn't fully representative. It is unbalanced in favor of the younger generation, which is kind of interesting in light of the responses, because this younger generation is going to become they will become the future politicians and business people. So 550 responses, surveys, which took about 30 to 40 minutes to fill. And as I said, they were pretty difficult questions. And in 3 languages, the respondents could choose either Russian or Kazakh or Kyrgyz. And so surveys were prepared in vernacular languages as well. They were the respondents were gender balanced, and most of them had graduated from the university or were about to graduate from the university. Okay, so that's just a few words about who took. So, all right. So now I will not present all of the data, but I'll just give you some in what in my view were interesting results from this survey. So one of the questions was worded like this: although the word democracy is widely used in all states and by all people of the world, this term is contested in both academic and political circles. A table below contains a list of attributes, processes, and institutions which are often associated with democracy. In your view, which of these attributes are indispensable to democracy? That is, without them, democracy cannot exist. Place a check mark next to those attributes in the table's right column. And then the respondents were given like a list of 15 or 20 different attributes. All right. So as you can see, I mean, we'll probably get a little bit higher, numbers if we were to run the survey in the United States. But overall, respondents in both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan would pass a test, right? They would probably, if there were like some multiple choice questions, they will probably choose pretty much the same responses that American students will choose. So in both cases, most of the respondents chose elections. Interestingly, educated citizenry was mentioned, especially in Kazakhstan. Democratic culture, local self-governance was very important, and I can comment on that, why I think it's really important. Both countries are undergoing some substantial reforms of local governance. Channels connecting the government and the citizens. Market economy, it was included into the notion of democracy. But overall, there is some, like, at least at the conceptual level, it seems to be, people kind of know what democracy is about. Okay. Now, from that, I asked them to kind of, I thought of testing the application, if they can apply all this knowledge for assessing some of the institutions that are operating in those countries as to whether or not those institutions are democratic. Okay? And the respondents could choose that this particular institution corresponds very much, does not correspond at all, or don't know. So there was like almost like a Likert scale of possible responses. And okay, it's interesting that in both cases, in both countries, most of the responses thought that family was the most democratic institution. On the second place is the president. Look at the bottom. And then, parliament and the labor groups, church. I mean, church received fewer check marks, but still, I mean, if 1/5 or more respondents think that, church is a democratic institution. So this tells me, number one, that maybe there is some discrepancy in between kind of the conceptual thinking and ability to apply this conceptual thinking for assessing the real life institutions. But it is also suggestive of the possibility that the respondents actually hold different understandings of what democracy is. And I think I'm more siding with the second understanding that, indeed, they do, they do understand what democracy in a Western sense, but they also hold some different notions or some different, so they hold different understandings of what democracy entails in their minds, and this will allow them to place family as well as their presidents into the category of being democratic. Then there was one, I was testing those statements and assertions that I found in the frames in the analysis of policy documents. So I prepared like a set of statements, and the respondents were asked either strongly agree or disagree or strongly disagree or just have no opinion. Okay? And so most of the people, the qualified majority in both countries, believe that, or they agreed or strongly agreed that before we can establish an effective democracy, we have to have a long period of economic reforms. Yeah, just like in the Central Asian democratization frame. Fewer people, but nonetheless, the majority of people agree that you can have a satisfactory human rights situation even in non-democratic states. Again, like fewer people in Kyrgyzstan, but the majority of respondents in Kazakhstan agreed or strongly agreed that there is no contradiction between Islam and democracy. With regard to the statement about whether or not values of Western states, West and East, are fundamentally different, 44% of respondents in Kazakhstan agreed or strongly agreed, and 56. One of the few questions where more Kyrgyz respondents agreed or strongly agreed. Again, the democracy can only be established after some high level of stability has been achieved in a state. Also, the majority of respondents agreed or strongly agreed. I didn't make up the numbers. I rounded them up, but in both countries, almost 70% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that a strong executive branch is necessary for pushing through state reform. So they're supporting strong executive. There was a statement that the state itself must be the main reformer, and again, 50% or so or more agreed with the statement. And then the last one, only the top-down reforms are effective. Again. All right. Then I wanted to find out, if I want to know something about how salient Western democratization frames are, I need to know what people are concerned the most about. And actually, the first question in the survey read something like that every state has a number of priorities, and there was like a list of various priorities that I chose from those countries' programs, security concept, strategic concept, foreign policy concept, addresses, and so there was like a list of various priorities that a state can pursue, and the respondents were asked to identify five that they think should be prioritized in the 5-year long time frame. And the first number before this slash is the number of respondents who chose this priority as number 1 priority. And the second number is the percentage of respondents who placed this priority within 5 top priorities. And they were quite lengthy lists, so I grouped them. And on the first place are the priorities related to independence, territorial integrity, security and stability of the state. But security and stability in the sense of being protected from external threats, okay? So in both cases, the majority of respondents. Then a lot of respondents chose internal threats, particularly those related to extremism, terrorism, drug trafficking, okay? Human rights seem to be a concern, just like economic growth and well-being. So if I were to kind of try to cluster all those respondents, 3 or 4 major groups emerge: security, external and internal, economic aspects, well-being, prosperity, human rights. And on the very, very last place, there are developing democracy, democratic principles, and some other goals related to democratization. Okay? And then following those concerns, I asked, so in your view, which ones of those political regimes listed below can solve all these concerns or problems that you just identified? And there were several choices of different political systems offered. And again, even though the majority of respondents thought that democracy would be able to deal successfully with those problems, it is striking that despite the fact that 25 to 30% of respondents were young, the almost 50% in Kyrgyzstan and 40% in Kazakhstan thought that communism, the communist political system, will still be pretty successful in resolving those issues. And then also a significant number of respondents thought that as any regime that is capable of maintaining order and stability. And just one more slide. Our conceptions about the world or democracy are based on some underlying values. And so I prepared like a list of values, and the respondents were given an opportunity to circle as many as they believe characterized them. Okay? And I'm not gonna overload this slide with all those values. I'm just gonna give you some examples. So the values that we typically associate with market or democracy, such as competitiveness and individualism in the first place, they receive the least number of, the fewer number of respondents circle those values, as well as few others. When you read literature on democracy, they say that they require this a special type of individual, who is independent, who is independent-minded, and tolerant. Many of the respondents didn't know what tolerance was. I was frequently asked, what does tolerance mean? Individualism, competitiveness. Whereas, honor, a lot of respondents show that. Respect for elder. Actually, those are the top categories, or top values in terms of, the number of people who circled them, they thought that they characterized who they were. Respect for elder people, taking care of parents, taking care of children. Okay, I don't want to generalize the collective values and so on. So, all right. So, these are the conclusions that I made before I carried out survey, and I'm kind of sticking to what I concluded before I went to Central Asia. So, in terms of the correspondence of Western versus Central Asian discourse to what the people, the cultural and political stock of those nations, the Western democratization frame has much lower resonance to society's cultural and political stock. And Central Asian democratization frame, and again, I'm not making any causal claims. It may be that because Central Asian elites have control over mass media, they continue to promote their own vision of what Central Asian democracy should be all about. But I don't think that it's just about the media effect and the influence of Central Asian elites and the people's perceptions and understandings of democracy. Consistency. Well, I don't want to go over it because I think it's part of a broader project. In terms of salience, again, recently there have been some changes to democracy promotion policies, both in the United States and European Union, and I like those changes. I think they're moving in the direction of kind of actually stepping away from this notion of democracy, using less more sensitive and less sensitive, more neutral terms such as good governance, and bringing in connecting democracy promotion with developmental projects. Still some work is needed, but there have been some movement toward bringing Central Asian elites to the table of negotiations when the Western donors are trying to design and decide on the programs and ways of investing their money, the kind of projects they want to carry out. So there will be much more closeness in the goals that the Western donors want to accomplish and what those countries want. Okay, and so what my belief in returning back to this question, what explains the ineffectiveness of Central Asia, of democracy promotion programs in Central Asia? My belief is that it is because they do not take into consideration the underlying historical, cultural conditions and what people want, what people know, how they understand the world, how they understand their own societies and political systems. So, instead of stressing the incompatibility of Western and Central Asian cultures, instead of trying to use American and European template for democracy and impose it or try to teach them about American or European democracy, those models should be carefully adjusted to what the people want, what they know, how they understand it. So, and it requires careful study of the democratizing society's political histories and defining elements of their political culture. And it requires much more flexibility in the design of democracy promotion programs to be able to include those regional and national sociocultural particularities. And lastly, it's democracy should not be an end goal in and of itself. Democracy, to me, it's just a method. It's a method for accomplishing something that we believe democracy is best at accomplishing, including human rights. So the emphasis should be shifted from democracy as an end result to the final results that we want to accomplish. Why do we want to transpose democracy there in the first place? Because we believe that it's going to bring human rights, equality, development, prosperity, security. So maybe those are the kind of things that should be emphasized, and all of the programs geared towards, not democracy per se, because it's not an end goal, but those final goals of democratization. Okay. I didn't want to be able to have some time for questions. That is why I kind of presented the data, not really spending too much time, hypothesizing or speculating about as to why this or that result turned out to be